Hey, what is going on, guys, and welcome to our 43rd in-depth character review, where today we are looking at the one and only Grand Admiral Thrawn. With Thrawn's legendary event coming out this past week, many are wondering if it is worth getting Thrawn because of all those Phoenix characters you have to gear up, so we will be talking about that as well as his very complex kit that he has. But before we do that, let's talk about Grand Admiral Thrawn's history in the Star Wars universe. One of the most cunning and ruthless warriors in the history of the Galactic Empire, Grand Admiral Thrawn was exiled from his home-world planet in the unknown regions due to his beliefs of preemptive strikes. After Thrawn was rescued by Imperial soldiers, his deadly ingenuity and keen tactical abilities swiftly caught the attention of Emperor Palpatine himself. Thrawn proved to be a brilliant warrior who became an indispensable asset to the Empire, whose loyalty was never questioned. He had a deep appreciation for art and analyzed many cultures and many philosophies so he can learn how to conquer his foes with absolute ease. As a result of seeing war as a theater, triumph upon triumph came his way, which also led to him seeing promotion on top of promotion despite the political opposition within the Empire, and his journey to power was one that also inspired ever greater admiration from the Empire. And with that out of the way, we can talk about how do you unlock this character and how do you gain more stars for this character, and the only way you can do that is through the legendary event, the Art of War. It's a legendary type of event similarly structured to Palpatine, R2-D2, as well as Grandmaster Yoda. In order to unlock Thrawn, you will need 5 5-star Phoenix characters. To get a 6-star Thrawn, you will need 5 6-star Phoenix characters, and lastly, and if you want a 7-star Grand Admiral Thrawn, you will need 5 7-star Phoenix characters to complete the event. So now you might be wondering, how does Grand Admiral Thrawn fit in the big picture of the game? And to answer that question, we are first going to look at the stats of Grand Admiral Thrawn before considering mods and abilities, and we first dive into the pros. The first thing we need to look at is speed, and for an Empire character, he is very fast. He is number 18 in speed, and he is holding 150, pushing that average of speed from 127 to now 128. But that's not all. Grand Admiral Thrawn has a lot of things where he is also number 14 in health, holding 25,981. But when we keep going further, we also see that this support character is number 23 in protection, where he is boasting 26,634 protection. And what the heck, while we are at it, let's look at the combined health and protection. And Grand Admiral Thrawn, he is not joking around here because he is number 16 in combined health and protection, where he has 52,615 combined health and protection. The next item on the list is maximum damage, where Grand Admiral Thrawn is sitting at a very comfortable number 8, where his maximum damage dealing attack is 8,631, which comes straight from his basic. And speaking of that basic, when looking at maximum basic damage, Grand Admiral Thrawn is number 2 in the game, with number 1 being Director Krennic. Grand Admiral Thrawn is right behind him at 8,631, and as we'll soon find out, he will be using that basic attack quite often in this game. But beyond that, when we look at the average and the cons, there is absolutely nothing to report in terms of the major stats in the game, which makes him the very first character in my reviews that has a perfect record when looking at the stats. So far, so good for Grand Admiral Thrawn. This now leads us to our next discussion of his kit, and by far, Grand Admiral Thrawn has the most complex kit in the game, which is very situational depending on what event you are participating in. First, we have his basic attack known as Manipulate, and when you attack someone, you grant that enemy speed up for 1 turn, or if they already had ability block, you inflict stun for 1 turn instead. And you might be wondering, why on Yoda's green earth would you want to give the enemy a buff? Well, this is why. When that speed up expires, either by the enemy finishing their turn or from you stripping away that speed up, you inflict ability block for 1 turn, and this effect cannot be resisted. And when you're going up against the raid boss, you instead inflict defense down for 2 turns, which cannot be resisted. Fracture is what really defines Grand Admiral Thrawn in this game. It has a 3-turn cooldown, and this is what makes him work in so many different lineups. He attacks an enemy 4 times in a row, dispels all the buffs on them, removes 50% turn meter, and inflicts Fracture, which is a new debuff until the start of Thrawn's next turn or until Thrawn is defeated. This fracture cannot be copied or dispelled, so you can't cleanse it, and this attack can't be evaded or resisted. And when you're using fracture up against a character, it sets their speed to 0, they can't gain any buffs, bonus attacks, or any sort of bonus turn meter. And against raid bosses, you reduce their speed by 50%, and this cannot stack with speed down. They can't gain any buffs, and they have a reduced counter chance by 30%. Some important mechanics to look at right now. When you're using this in Galactic War, let's say Thrawn had 2 turns left for a cooldown on Fracture. That cooldown is carried over to the next battle, and it is not reset to 0 every time you start a new Galactic War battle. Also, if you are using Darth Nihilus and you put Fracture on an enemy, the fractured enemy is not guaranteed to have his cooldown increase when Darth Nihilus uses his special ability. Grand Admiral's command is his next special. It has a 3-turn cooldown, and he is able to swap turn meter with a target ally, dispel all debuffs on both Thrawn and that ally, and they both recover 40% protection. We now have a new leader for the Empire, and it is known as Legendary Strategist. Empire allies have plus 15% maximum protection, plus 25% offense, and gain 20% turn meter whenever they resist a detrimental effect or suffer a debuff. The Zeta upgrade adds 2% protection regeneration whenever an Empire ally gains or loses any sort of status effect, both buffs and debuffs. And the thing we all have been asking for a long time, this Imperial Cleanser allows Empire allies to gain a new special ability known as Maneuver, which allows Empire characters to dispel any debuffs on themselves and gain 50% turn meter, and this new ability has a 3-turn cooldown as well when you finally do use it. And lastly, we have Ebb and Flow, which is his unique ability, also has a Zeta. When you give him his Zeta, Thrawn has a plus 100% counter chance, plus 100% tenacity, yes, you heard me right, minus 50% speed while any enemies are fractured. Whenever another Empire ally uses a special ability while Thrawn is active, that ally gains 15% turn meter, and furthermore, if any enemies are fractured, Thrawn and fractured enemies lose 15% turn meter. And the Zeta upgrade, in case you are wondering, increases the tenacity and counter chance to 100%, as well as granting the ability to remove turn meter from Thrawn and the fractured enemy. Now don't worry, we'll talk more about how to use Grand Admiral Thrawn, how does Ebb and Flow actually work, all that great stuff, but I just want to quickly show you a graphic showing the gear requirements for Grand Admiral Thrawn. Overall, he is not the easiest character to gear. He's about average for Rancor Raid gear, about average for AAT gear, Gold gear, but the most notable thing is Purple gear. He is number 4 in Purple gear requirements, needing 1,650 pieces, and the most popular pieces you will need are 400 Mark III Carbanti sensor arrays, 150 Mark V stun guns, and 80 Mark III hollow projectors. With all that objective stuff out of the way, let's scoot right on over to my subjective part of the review, and there's a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. Overall though, Thrawn is an amazing character. He works in many different lineups, and it's pretty much an example of how he is yet another new character who continues to push the boundaries of what is possible in this game. He addresses many issues we've been having in this game. Enemies evading attacks left and right, enemies constantly cleansing anything you try to apply to them, and Thrawn also has finally found a way to penetrate the tenacity of that the enemy has relied on quite a lot lately. With Grand Admiral Thrawn on the battlefield, I've been winning so many battles against triple, quadruple, and quintuple cleanse teams, Darth Maul Zeta teams, pretty much any single team out there. Thrawn can help you win the battle. Grand Admiral Thrawn in this game is a pretty accurate representation of how he actually is in the Star Wars universe. When you're using Grand Admiral Thrawn, it almost feels like as if you're directing a play on the theater stage by having all the strings you need to control the battle. Being able to completely remove an enemy from battle is absolutely insane. When you're using Fracture, you can pick the enemy that you want to not be in battle whatsoever. Most likely, Darth Nihilus is going to be your number 1 priority, so he is not reducing cooldowns and therefore using his Annihilate. But you also might consider fracturing characters like Kenobi or Baze so they're not taunting, fracturing Savage Opress so he's not gaining turn meter and cleansing his fellow Sith allies. Shirut is also another character you might go and fracture. But no matter who you decide on fracturing, keep this in mind. The goal of using Fracture on an enemy is to ensure Grand Admiral Thrawn does not take another turn. You pick the one enemy you want to remove from battle, fracture them, and the goal is once that enemy is fractured, you leave them be until the end of the battle and focus on all the other characters. Anytime an Empire ally uses a special ability, you are constantly removing turn meter from both Thrawn as well as the enemy who is fractured, and the more turn meter you remove from Thrawn, the longer he is holding that character in fracture for the duration of the battle. I'm showing how this works right now, and once you've chosen the enemy which you have determined to be the pillar of the enemy team, you want to cripple that pillar by applying fracture to the enemy and constantly try to remove turn meter from Thrawn, and that is by spamming special abilities from your fellow Empire allies. You also may notice I sometimes use maneuver. Even though the Empire ally does not have a debuff, you just use maneuver to gain turn meter as well as reduce the turn meter for Grand Admiral Thrawn, so you are holding that fractured enemy as long as possible so you have enough time to work on all the other enemies in the game. In this situation that Grand Admiral Thrawn finally does take a turn, he lets go of that enemy from fracture, and to get back into using fracture really quickly, here's the strategy that I've been using. You want to assess the battle, see who is the weakest ally, who took the most hits, use Grand Admiral's command, granting both Thrawn as well as that ally 40% protection. Then the next time Thrawn takes a turn, use maneuver if he is leading, so he gains 50% turn meter, and then he can quickly go back into using fracture once more. Grand Admiral Thrawn is seriously an amazing character, and it's hard to summarize everything right now, but just know a lot of the gameplay you are seeing in this video is Grand Admiral Thrawn at gear 9 and 5 stars, battling it out in the top end of arena and winning almost every single battle thrown his way. The only main drawback of Grand Admiral Thrawn, it has nothing to do with his numbers, nothing to do with his kit, because they are pretty much perfect. The only thing, like many other characters, is the AI. He has such a complicated kit. There is a very specific strategy when using him, and the AI does not seem to grasp it, and it makes him very easy to defeat on defense. So now you're probably going to be seeing a lot of Admiral Thrawns on the enemy team. He is a very flexible character, and you need to know who his mortal enemies are, and it's very hard to find the perfect mortal enemy, unlike many others. But mainly the big ones are those that can increase his cooldowns really early, such as Darth Nos or Death Trooper. If you can happen to apply ability block or stun before he fractures an enemy, anti-Empire characters like Biggs or Baze do some big damage up against Grand Admiral Thrawn. If you can somehow get past his 100% tenacity, Daze is great to prevent him from countering while he finally fractured one of your allies. Big damage dealing characters to wipe him out quickly to quickly end that fracture debuff on one of your characters. Using characters like Savage or Darth Nihilus help end Grand Admiral Thrawn a lot faster in battle. Boba Fett is able to avoid taunters, so he can go around the tanks protecting Thrawn and go right at him, helping you get rid of that fracture that is on one of your allies, which is a very helpful thing. For the best friends segment, we are mixing things up just a little bit because essentially, since Grand Admiral Thrawn is Emperor Palpatine 2.0 on steroids, he can literally work in any type of lineup. So the graphic I'm showing now is a bunch of different lineups that I've used or I have seen win battles with absolute ease. And then we will talk about some best friends and some notable things you should keep in mind when using Grand Admiral Thrawn in a team. Shore Trooper has been a very fun option. You might be seeing him in arena a lot more than he was before because of the fact that Thrawn grants 15% turn meter when special abilities are used, and Shore Trooper also grants 15% turn meter when specials are used, meaning a lot of the time you'll be granting 30% turn meter to allies who are Empire characters. And the more turn meter means the more special abilities are used, which means the slower Thrawn will be, which means you will be locking down the enemy with fracture for a longer period of time. A more advanced character to use is General Kenobi because Grand Admiral Thrawn only counterattacks when he fractures an enemy, so you might want to give him retribution so he can counterattack even when he's not fracturing enemy, which means more speed up, which means more ability block, and means more unresistible stuns for the enemy. The more Empire characters you take out of Thrawn's team, it means the shorter amount of time Thrawn will have to hold a fractured enemy in place. And quickly looking at the mods, in terms of the mod set, there are just so many ways to mod him. He's a very flexible character. My personal favorite is using either critical chance or critical damage together, or offense to increase his damage output, making his basic attack even stronger for when he's counterattacking, defense to make him even take more damage, and tenacity is also a great option to ensure he is not being prevented from using his fracture early on. And unlike many characters in this game, when looking at the primary and secondary mods, speed is not your #1 priority anymore. Put a little speed on them, such as 60 speed, maybe even less, but no need to go beyond that, because you want him to artificially be slow to prolong the amount of time he holds an enemy fractured. So after giving him just a teeny amount of speed, focus on things such as his damage output and protection to ensure he is holding his ground as long as possible, while also doing deadly damage when enemies dare to attack him. And biggest thing of all, no potency is needed for Thrawn whatsoever, so avoid using potency mods of any sort. And lastly, we have Yoda's do or do not checklist, and I'm just going to briefly go over all this. Essentially, every single one of these is an absolute do, except for ships. Since he is a Grand Admiral and perhaps arguably one of the best admirals in the whole entire Star Wars universe, I without a doubt in my mind believe they will eventually add his Chimera to the game, which is the fleet he did use in the Star Wars universe. And with all that being said, let's pull up the Hall of Fame and rank Grand Admiral Thrawn. And from Grandmaster to Youngling, we are going to be ranking Grand Admiral Thrawn without a doubt in my mind as a Grand Master. And going a step further, I am now adding a very subjective status to only one character in the game who will reserve my spot for my personal favorite character in Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes, and that status is known as the Chosen One. And we are going to give that status for the very first time to Grand Admiral Thrawn. But there you have it, guys. That concludes our in-depth review, and overall, Grand Admiral Thrawn is a must-have character. When you do have the time, get him, because once you master his kit, the world is honestly your stage to control. In the comments down below, let me know who our next in-depth character review should be on. Also, do like this video if you did enjoy it. Check out my Patreon page if you want to hang out with me on a monthly basis and gain access to these in-depth review materials. And be sure to subscribe so you're not missing a thing. And we will talk again very soon. Peace out.